Bruce, and thank you everyone at the Writing Project for just being such a big support. I think if not for those 2 summers that I did teachers as writers, that little week in the summer to write, and then my own writing part of my summer institute, I don't know if I would have really immersed myself enough in writing to complete this project. So I'm forever grateful to the Writing Project. So I was thinking about the theme when I first got Bruce's email, and I went on YouTube and watched the video of the song. I don't know if anybody else did that, but the link I went to, the song was translated into Spanish, and I thought that's somehow really appropriate for voice and identity and respectful dialogue. And I was thinking that that in that we are called upon to be translators, kind of cultural translators. When we bring literature into the classroom for our kids from a different perspective, we're translating for them something they can't necessarily see. And when we help them write about their own experiences for communication with the world, we're helping them to translate. And I think the key piece that makes that most effective is telling a story. And I thought that was my brilliant idea until I went to my 2 workshops today where they basically said the same thing. So I think we're all hearing that it's the element of story that allows people to open up and listen and hear us. And so one example is when I teach Raisin in the Sun, which I'm hearing also a lot of folks are doing. If I start theoretical and I talk about housing and the GI Bill and redlining and all this, sometimes, and I still do that, but that will sometimes trigger some not very respectful dialogue. But as soon as we begin the play and the kids are reading Walter and Mama and Benita, and I'm asking them to play those roles or connect, they can always empathize. They can always find a way to connect. So it's the story. And when they write, too, I was lucky enough to do the argument, C3WP argument training. And I find when they write arguments about social issues, when they include some anecdote, some personal connection, even especially a story, it makes it just so much more approachable and readable and effective. So it is a good segue because in this memoir, I was really trying to tell a story about a subject that's often written about in a very academic, theoretical, research-based kind of way, which is whiteness and white privilege and white identity in the context of racism. So when I began to read about this and really think about this somewhere in my 20s, I couldn't find a lot of stories, memoirs, literary memoirs that had that as a forefront of an issue. I read a lot of really good books. But one of my inspirations was Toni Morrison, who says that if there's a book that you really want to read and it hasn't been written, then you have to write it. So I set out somewhere in my 30s, about 15 years ago, to write what I wanted to be a literary memoir about a white person who's going through the transformation of understanding race, racism, white privilege, white identity, and just what that looks like on the inside. And another inspiration for me was Beverly Tatum. So one of the books I read during that period was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she actually has a chapter called White Identity Development, which I never had heard of, never realized people wrote about. And I studied that, religiously. And one of the things she said in there was that more white people should tell their stories to sort of help each other navigate this road to a new way of thinking and a way of becoming more active and anti-racist. So those were a couple inspirations that made me write. People often ask, like, what made you write this book? Those were some things. So the book's called Too White, and I like to speak a little bit about what that means. It's sort of a provocative title, and I often wish I had more time when I'm telling people about my book to really explain it. So I'm going to take a little bit of time, and it really means a variety of things. So the book is written in 5 parts. In each part, I think Too White means something slightly different. So in part 1, I write about growing up in suburban Connecticut and just being very racially isolated. So in part 1, I'm exploring, I think, the meaning of being too white as being too isolated. And so many of us and our students are still living that out. So if you're in such an isolated society, it's really hard to make connections and have empathy and get past stereotypes and assumptions and prejudice and biases and things that we absorb. So that's one meaning of too white. I was lucky enough, my senior year of college, to go abroad for a year to Ghana, West Africa, and I loved it. And when I began comparing myself where I was from to that culture, I began to feel that too white was to be too reserved, too controlled, too repressed. I was from a very waspy family, and I started to see things in terms of race, really polarizing it in terms of black and white, and starting to really glamorize what I decided was black culture, which was the opposite of all those things. It was very vibrant and expressive and connected and social and communal, and I started really craving that identity, and then really started disparaging and being ashamed of and wanting to reject what I saw as whiteness, which was, controlled and repressed and reserved. So I went through that phase for a long time. It was probably very annoying to a lot of people. When I came home, I had got like dreadlocks and only, it was, so it's this long identity story. But when I came home, I also began teaching, and my first job was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was just really savage poverty that I had never seen. And it was crazy to me that it was about 20 minutes from where I grew up in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is probably one of the most affluent communities in the world. So that drive just blew my mind, and too white began to mean too racist, too complicit in a racist system that I was finally seeing really clearly in front of my eyes. And without a background in white identity development or anti-racism or social justice, which I didn't have, it just began to feel, I began to be very angry and really angry at whiteness and being white, and then not really having a way of knowing what to do about that. So the identity struggle kind of continued. And I also began to see too white as too individualistic. It seemed to me that this capitalist system and being out for yourself was sort of a white thing. And everywhere I looked, people of color seemed to be able to build community a little better. So I really did kind of get stuck in that polarization for a long time. I finally left Bridgeport. So in part 4, I moved to a community in Cambridge and Boston, and intentionally sought out friends of color and began to reject my white friends, continued culturally appropriating all kinds of black identity forms, and really copying, in some ways, negative stereotypes that I had absorbed about blackness. So that was the irony. In trying to reject racism, I was actually adopting a lot of racist practices. So I was really conflicted and confused. The good news is that I left Boston, came out to Western Mass, and I did start to read, and I started to write, and began to learn about anti-racism and social justice. Luckily, I was in Amherst, and there was a lot of little pockets of people educating and doing work around those things. By then, I had a biracial daughter. I was teaching in a classroom, and I just started to learn. I attended something called the White Privilege Conference, and began to understand my experience in a larger context. So I learned that you can't necessarily be less white, but you can be less of all those other things. You can be less racially isolated. You can be less reserved and controlled if that's how you want to be. You can be less individualistic and more community-centered. You can be less complicit in racist systems once you begin learning and learning how to dismantle those things and joining together with people who are working on dismantling those things. And you can be not necessarily less privileged, but more aware of your privilege, able to extend those privileges to other people, and less guilty. There's a lot of examining white guilt, too, in here, and also learning that that's something you can move past. And I forgot to read my Baldwin quote, darn it. I'm going to read you 2 Baldwin quotes. I like to start with one and end with the other, but James Baldwin is probably one of the best writers about race in America. And he says, "White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, or it will no longer be needed." So I really love how he shines the light on the psychology, the white psychology that gave birth to systemic racism. So he writes about systemic racism, which is really important, but he also really gets into the emotional and spiritual and psychological landscape of white people who created racism. And that's what I was craving to learn about and trying to write about myself. So at the end, I want to share a second quote from towards the end of his book as well. It says, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. So I found those really inspiring quotes from him.